Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I always have to laugh every time I hear that bio. I have to reword it, I think, a little bit because it says, since completing my education in 1993, which makes it sound like I haven't learned a thing since 1993. In fact, it's probably just the opposite. I think my real education started after I left school, working at places like the Bank of Canada and CP Rail and the Canada West Foundation. But I do thank you for the kind introduction and thank you for inviting me to Jasper. One of the joys of my job at ATB Financial is that I get to travel around all sorts of places around Alberta, and I have to say Jasper is one of my favorite places to come. So I was very happy when Don invited me up to the Jasper Park Lodge for this presentation this morning. My presentation is entitled Sunny with a Chance of Showers, which is a bit of an offbeat sort of title for an economics presentation. Bear with me, by the end of the presentation it will all make sense. But what I'm going to do is sort of offer up where I think Alberta's economy is going, particularly next year. So I'm keeping my time frame a little bit short. I'm looking sort of 1 year out. We're going to talk a lot about the global economy at the moment, interesting things going on there. Obviously the US economy, the Canadian environment, and then we'll focus it in onto what's happening in Alberta's economy and where I think certain sectors of the economy are going to be going next year. So when we look at the global economy and we look at all of these economic indicators that economists like myself track, these indicators right now are pointing in a lot of different directions, and it's making it pretty difficult to get a really good, decent read of where we're at in terms of the global economic business cycle. It was only about maybe 8 or 10 months ago, maybe right around the beginning of 2010, these global economic indicators were all pointing generally in the same direction, and that was towards a recovery period. But over the spring and summer, everything sort of fell apart, the wheels fell off the bus, so to speak, and now these indicators are pointing in all different directions. Difficult to get a sense of where we're going. It does matter, however, which part of the world in which you're standing or in which economy you're talking about. So let's take a bit of a tour around the world and talk about a few interesting places and the economic indicators and the outlook in those spots. Let's start first of all in Germany. Well, the German economy is actually doing quite well now that we're into the tail end of 2010. The German economy, as with every Western economy, did suffer a pretty hard knock on the head and a recession in 2009. But it came flying out of recession in 2010, largely led by strong export growth. Germany, to sort of the same degree as Canada, is an export-oriented economy. Now, what they're exporting is much different than what Canada is, but they're very dependent on foreign markets. And over the spring and summer, when the euro was taking a big nosedive, you might remember that really led to a big boost in exports from Germany, a lot of manufacturing, a lot of output. Since that time, the euro has clawed its way back up a little bit, so things are cooling off again in Germany. But Germany does remain the European economy in the very best shape. And in fact, their banking and financial sector has come through the downturn in better shape than a lot of other places in Europe. And Germany, you could add in there the Netherlands and Denmark and maybe some of the Scandinavian countries, are really the true leaders in terms of where the growth in the European economy is at the moment. So good news in Germany, not so good when we turn a little to the southwest and talk about Spain. I think Spain is an interesting country to talk about right now. There's been a lot of attention paid, of course, to places like Greece and Portugal, but Spain is a much larger economy than is Greece. Greece in the global scheme, Greece is almost a trivially sized economy. Dramatic things happening in Greece, and I think that's why it got a lot of press and a lot of questions around, is Greece or is the euro going to even hang together back in May and June with their sovereign debt problems. But I think Spain is maybe a little bit more interesting simply because the size of the Spanish economy makes it a bit larger of a player. The Spanish economy is not doing very well at all. Its unemployment rate is 20%, if you can imagine that. And for young people, those aged 15 to 24, the unemployment rate is 45%. It's more or less hopeless if you're a young person coming out of school in Spain at the moment. Spain, it was hit very, very hard by the banking and financial sector, the credit crisis. Its sort of system of regional banks in Spain they were sort of the economic miracle of the last decade, but they did not really hang together when the going got tough. A lot of overbuild, a lot of, too much residential investment going on in Spain, and now everything is sort of unraveled. So I do expect Spain is going to have many years, perhaps 5 or even 10 years, very painful restructuring, getting their government balances or their government books into balance. And in the meantime, we're seeing, not just in Spain, but other places in Europe too, some very angry voters who aren't too happy at all about some of the painful restructuring that's going to have to take place. So not too good a situation in Spain. Let's talk again about a happier place in the global economy, and that's India. I think India will actually be the economy to watch over the next 10 years. There's a lot of attention always paid, of course, to China, and without question, China, the world's second largest economy, it has been an economic powerhouse over the last 10 years in terms of its growth rates. But I think if the last decade belonged to China, and its coming of age as an economic power, I think the coming decade, the next decade, could belong to India. And I actually think growth prospects in India will surpass those in China. It's not that India will maybe surpass China in absolute size of its economy, but I think the growth rates have a better chance of holding up than they do in China. A couple of reasons for that. The demographics are working in India's favor, and they're working against China. China, it's been about 25 years since they've had their first child policy, or their single child policy. That is affecting now the demographics there, and they're aging just like we are here in the Western economies. India is facing no demographic crunch like that at all. India is also a democratically governed country. Sure, there are some bumps and bruises along the way for a country like India in terms of its government. But it is a democratically elected government. It is in English speaking. English is the language of business in India. I think both those things will help India as it continues to build some global ties. And I think growth prospects in India over the next 10 years are very, very good. Let's turn to the United States and talk about what's happening to our BFF, our largest trading partner. I love the picture of this eagle. Not only is the eagle a beautiful bird and emblematic of our friends to the south, but the look on the eagle's face is maybe a little like what U.S. homeowners, the look on their faces as they were watching their home prices sort of tumble and not yet recover. The U.S. economy is not in good shape. And this does remain the single largest problem for the global economic recovery. The U.S., of course, is still without question the world's largest economy. And when the U.S. is not doing well, the global economy is never really going to, there's going to be parts of it like emerging nations, China and India, but the global economy is going to have a hard time really finding its feet without the U.S. economy growing. And in Canada, we really understand this quite well. U.S. economy, well, the biggest problem is within the labor market. You're seeing these unemployment rates very close to 10%, stubbornly high, and the rate of employment has not yet even come close to putting a dent in that unemployment rate. You really need economic growth to be about 3% just in order for job creation to match population growth. Anything below 3% GDP growth, that unemployment rate is going to have a hard time coming down. And right now the U.S. is probably looking at 1 or maybe 1.5% growth. When I was a child, this is innocently what we meant by double dip. Now, when economists talk about double dip, it's the question of, is the U.S. heading for a double dip style recovery or double dip recession, W-shaped? The incidence of double dip recessions are actually quite rare. There's only been one since the post-World War II period in the U.S., and that was right around 1980, 1982, where they did sustain a W-shaped recession. So they're actually quite rare, and it does not actually look, on balance, like the U.S. is heading for another outright contraction, another recession. So that's the good news, is that they probably won't end up in another recession. The bad news is their non-recession is going to be pretty flat, pretty weak, pretty anemic growth, possibly for the next 3 or 4 years. It's a credit-driven recession. Therefore, the recovery is not reacting to the normal, post-recession kinds of instruments that typically they use. Normally, once the recession's over, interest rates come down and the economy comes roaring back to life. Well, we don't have any more interest rates to cut. The Federal Reserve, they're trying to learn a few lessons and trying desperately to prop up the U.S. economy. One lesson that we all learn pretty early in life, and you hear the expression, it's the early bird that gets the worm. But there is another life lesson that sometimes we don't pay enough attention to, and that is, it's the second mouse that gets the cheese. Sometimes it's good to be early. Other times it is good to just take a nice long pause and wait and see what's going to happen before you take any action. And this is decidedly where the Federal Reserve wants to be right now. They are in no hurry to raise interest rates. We won't likely see an interest rate increase in the United States for another 12 or possibly 18 months. And in fact, the very opposite. The Federal Reserve has signaled pretty strongly that they don't have any interest rate to cut anymore. But the second round of the quantitative easing is likely to come next month. QE2, it used to refer to a lady sitting on a throne in England or a highway between Edmonton and Calgary. Now QE2 is the second round of quantitative easing. The Federal Reserve buying these bonds and mortgages and basically dropping a bomb of cash onto the U.S. economy in an attempt to not only stimulate the economy with more cash, but keep those longer-term interest rates, those 5- and 10-year bond rates and mortgages, try to keep those low. The question was, well, did the first round of quantitative easing work, and is a second round necessary, or will it work? The jury is sort of out if the first one worked or not. It certainly didn't work in terms of, bringing the U.S. strongly back to growth, but I suppose it did work in preventing the U.S. economy from sinking even further, or the recession going on even longer. So we're in very much uncharted territory here with the U.S. economy and what the Federal Reserve is doing. The big threat, the thing that they are terrified of, is deflation. Sort of Japanese style, what Japan got itself into in around 1991, 92, and has never really recovered from that. So now the Fed, along with Washington, they're trying very hard to just prevent a deflationary spiral in the U.S., dropping all this cash, lowering interest rates, knowing, everyone knows full well, this is going to have consequences down the line. Rising levels of debt and that much cash in the U.S. economy is, without question, going to lead to inflation at some point. It might not even be inflation within the U.S. economy. It might show up elsewhere. But it will be inflationary. That's coming further down the road. For now, the threat is deflation, and that's what they're trying very desperately to avoid. Let's talk about the Canadian economy, and then we'll turn to Alberta and what's going to happen here. The Canadian economy is doing much better than the U.S. economy. However, the Canadian economy, too, has been slowing down over the summer and now into the fall. We're seeing a decided sort of cooling of our economy. We were the fastest growing economy in the G7, but since the summer, we've been overtaken by Germany as the fastest growing of the G7. Nonetheless, Canada and the Canadian economy remains in fairly good shape. The Bank of Canada, Mark Carty, they're looking at the Canadian economy over the spring and into the summer, deciding to raise interest rates. There were 3 rate increases, June, July, and September, bringing us to that overnight rate of 1%. Still extraordinarily low, very easy monetary policy. A neutral rate would be around 4 or 4.5% for that overnight rate. We're at 1%, so it's still pretty low. Although we are the only G7 country that has sort of pulled the trigger and started raising interest rates. I do think that the Bank of Canada, they're not really saying so, but I think they are going to take a nice long pause before we see any more rate increases. Certainly there won't be one in December. That's the last one they have of their fixed announcement dates left in 2010. And I don't think we'll see another rate increase in Canada until perhaps April or May of 2011, depending, of course, what transpires between now and then. It's always hard to say. That little Canadian dollar, well, it just keeps chugging along. It always sort of dips and swoons, and it's up and down, but I do think there is going to be more upward momentum left in the Canadian dollar. Of course, this isn't so much a Canadian dollar story, it's really a weakening U.S. dollar story. When you look at the Canadian dollar vis-a-vis other global currencies like the pound sterling and the euro and the yen, the Canadian dollar actually has not performed very well at all over the last year. In fact, we've been one of the weaker currencies. Where we are showing strength, where everyone is showing strength, is vis-a-vis the U.S. dollar. And, arguably, for Canada, it really is only the U.S. dollar that really matters in any true sense. Without question, they're our largest trading partner. So what happens vis-a-vis the U.S. dollar is what's important to the Canadian economy. More strength left in that Canadian dollar, as I do think the U.S. dollar is still in for more depreciation. That is, without question, going to have a negative effect on the Canadian economy. There's always this debate, is a strong loonie, is it good or bad? This is where economists are really the dismal scientists, because I remember, well, probably all of you remember, back when the dollar kept falling lower and lower, 70 cents, 65 cents. At that time, economists were all dismal, and we should dump this loonie, and this is awful, and how embarrassing, and the Canadian peso, and it was just all bad news. Now that the Canadian dollar is strong, it's like all bad news. It's bad news both ways for economists with the Canadian dollar. I'm not so dismal about the Canadian dollar being strong, or certainly around it trading close to par. I think that the Canadian economy has been more flexible than maybe we thought it would be. Back in 2000, I think it was 2002, when the Canadian dollar hit a low of about 62 cents. If you would have surveyed economists at the time and said, the Canadian dollar is going to climb to par within the next 5 or 6 years, and it's going to stay there, I think economists at that point would say, well, there is no possible way the Canadian economy would be able to sustain that. We're just not competitive enough. This will be the end of the Canadian economy. Well, here we are with a dollar. It's been at par, and a couple of times, very close to par now, and we're among the strongest growing countries in the G7. So I think that our exporters, without question, it has been a painful adjustment on them. And many have, sort of gone by the wayside. But I think that the Canadian economy and our exporters are more flexible, more adaptable, perhaps than we gave them credit for. And if you view it that way, and every time that Canadian dollar rises against the US dollar, we are actually wealthier as a country, as individuals, if we're holding, as most of us do, our assets in Canadian dollars, real estate, or whatever. Holding our assets in Canadian dollars, we are wealthier every time that Canadian dollar goes up. So I actually see more upside to a strong loonie than downside. But without question, if that loonie does rise above par, and for every cent it increases, it will act as another sort of drag on the Canadian economy, taking even more pressure off the Bank of Canada to start raising rates. So they may delay even longer. Okay, let's turn to the Alberta economy. I'm going to spend the rest of the time I have talking about what's going on in this province and how all of these global factors are affecting us. I can't actually verify this photo was taken in Alberta, but it looks like a pretty typical Alberta scene. And I will draw to your attention particularly the weather patterns. This is, I think, what a lot of us suffered all summer long. Very unsettled weather conditions. Over to the right, there is some blue sky, so there is some pleasantness to this. There's some nice white fluffy cloud. And you'll notice the sun is actually shining in the photo. But over to the left, we probably have hurricane-like conditions. We certainly have hail, nasty rain. There's even rainbows in the photo. If I could have found a photo that had snow, then we would have had all 4 seasons in one picture, which wouldn't have been too much of a stretch. But this picture, I think, the weather patterns in this picture, I want to borrow from the weather forecasters. Weather forecasters, economists, we're in the same difficult spot a lot of times because we're constantly being asked, what's going to happen next? What's the forecast? I think weather forecasters, they maybe get it right more of the time than economists, but they do have the use of satellite imagery. We don't have anything quite like that. But I'm going to borrow some of the language and some of the imagery from our weather forecasting friends to present what I think is likely to happen in Alberta's economy in 2011. And we're going to look at a few specific sectors. So here's my Alberta economic weather forecast. And here's where the title of the presentation, sunny with a chance of showers, starts to make sense. So conventional crude oil, well, we've got mostly sunny conditions, but with some intermittent cloud and some showers coming through, but the temperature is holding up not too badly at all. Crude oil and the fact that it has recovered to, within that $70 to $80 range band. We're above $80 now, of course. But it's been actually quite consistent within that $70 to $80 range for almost a year. And it's almost an unusual period of stability for global oil prices, especially when you consider the roller coaster that we were on in 2008 and 2009. So now we are in a pretty consistent band, $70 to $80. It always dips up and down, within that range. But I think Alberta oil producers are generally pretty happy, the conventional producers, pretty happy with oil in that range. Where I think oil prices are going next, I don't spend all of my time as an energy analyst, so I don't know if I'm the best person. I know there's a lot of other people in the room who probably spend more time forecasting oil. But I actually have a hard time believing that oil prices are going to get too much above where they're at now, at least on a sustained basis. And that is simply because the U.S. economy is too weak. And 2011, I don't think, will be a tremendously strong growth year for the U.S. They are still the world's #1 consumer of oil, but it's not where the growth is coming from. And they're actually using less oil these days, and I think that trend will continue a little bit. So probably not a lot of upward pressure above, $80, $85. But on the positive side, I really don't see an environment where those oil prices are going to fall below, say, $60 on a sustained basis, simply because there we have too much demand coming from China and India. So my best guess is that oil prices will continue to fluctuate between a band of about $65 to $80, but those prices will be perfectly acceptable, I think, to Alberta oil producers. Where we are not seeing pleasant conditions at all is in natural gas, and here's where we have some very unpleasant thunder showers and cooling temperatures. Natural gas, as most probably you guys in this room understand, has been the main reason why Alberta suffered a recession in the first place, and why things are still a little bit sluggish coming out of the recession in 2010. And again, most of you probably understand that how important natural gas has been as a driver of this provincial economy. We talk in Alberta, we talk about the oil and gas sector, that's sort of the parlance that we have. We really should have been talking about the gas, and there's also oil sector, at least over the last 15 years, because gas has been such a tremendous driver of the economy, and particularly provincial government revenues. These days, however, with natural gas sort of stuck below $4, it's going to be pretty tough for Alberta producers, most of them needing prices much closer to like $6 or $7. And with gas where it's at now, pretty difficult environment. I don't see those prices increasing a whole lot in 2011. Sure, there might be periods where it spikes up, weather conditions or whatever might cause those oil or gas prices to spike. But there's just simply too much shale supply coming out of the U.S. And you guys probably know this story as well as anybody. So it's going to be a little bit difficult on the natural gas side. Where we do see some very sunny, warm conditions is on the oil sides. Beautiful sunny skies and temperatures heating up. The oil sands, the bitumen producers, this is, I think, without question, the #1 driver of the provincial economy, the overall economy at the moment. Again, with those bitumen, with those oil prices having recovered, a lot of those oil sand projects are now going ahead full steam, and they're perfectly profitable. Not all of them, mind you. I mean, when we did see the big collapse in 2008, a lot of those projects were pulled back. Not all of them have come back. Some of those projects still need oil, bitumen, around 95 or maybe higher. But a lot of those projects have come back. Fort McMurray has certainly recovered all of the employment that it lost in 2009. And if you go up to Fort McMurray, it doesn't even feel like there's been really any sort of recession at all. But I do think that if we are seeing some sunny skies and warm conditions, we are seeing some nasty wind conditions. In Calgary, we'd call the Chinook headaches. The wind conditions making things a little less pleasant for the oil sand producers are coming not from the economics. The economics of those projects generally work. Where the struggle and where the challenge is coming from is on the environmental side. And we've seen all through 2010 a lot of drama, playing on with the environmental groups and film directors coming up and all kinds of people saying nasty things about us and Greenpeace activists, and there's been all sorts of things going on. I think most Albertans would, I think they would admit that the environmental groups there is a point to be made about some of the things going on in the oil sands. I don't think anyone would deny that. But I think Albertans also understand that oftentimes the environmental groups have been using incomplete information, sometimes just wrong information, and have not really been playing fair a lot of times in their PR war against the oil sands. Canada, maybe because we are a kind, liberal democracy country, we don't shoot protesters on sight, it makes us an easier target, You ask the Greenpeace, are you strapping yourself to oil rigs in Libya? I doubt it, You're just not going to be doing that. Or Saudi Arabia, or Nigeria, or the list goes on and on. So they look at Canada and say, we can strap ourselves to just about anything in Canada. They'll bring us hot chocolate. And I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do. In fact, I'd rather live in a country where we don't shoot people, for doing that. but it has opened us up to being a pretty easy target on the environmental front. Without question, there is work that needs to be done. In fact, redoubling efforts to convince Albertans and Canadians, and indeed the world, that what we're doing up there is an environmentally sustainable way to extract oil. There is work to be done but I do think that the environmental groups have not been always fair in their assessments or in their tactics. Okay, labor markets. Here's where we have a mix of sun and cloud, but the temperature holding in there not too badly. Alberta is alone among the provinces, at least among the major provinces, in terms of we have not recovered employment losses that we sustained during the recession. We're still below our highest peak, which we reached sometime in the middle of 2008. The question is, why has Alberta's employment numbers not come back to the same degree they have in other provinces? And my guess is, and this is only my guess because I really don't have any statistics on this, but you look back at the period 2005 to 2008, what was the number one problem facing employers in this province? It was labor shortages, right? You couldn't trick people. You had to bribe people with iPods and somehow coerce them into coming to work for you. Trips to Mexico and all these crazy things. You know, and that was not actually a healthy labor market at all. So then comes our unemployment rates at 3%. Then comes the downturn in 2008, 2009. A lot of those workers were showing the door. But I think Alberta companies right now, they've hired back some people. But I think they're looking at the core of workers that they have remaining. These people are very skilled and educated. They're good at their jobs. They're motivated to be there. You know, a lot of the iPod group they weren't particularly motivated to be at work and took a lot of liberties. The ones who are still working are a very motivated, very productive labor force. And I think Alberta companies are saying, yeah, order books are filling up and demand is coming back. But with the workers we have remaining, we're more than capable of matching that demand without having yet to hire back a lot of those iPod kind of workers. I do think that will change. I do think Alberta will be into a situation of labor shortages again. I don't think it'll come in 2011. I think that unemployment rate will stay it'll drift downward slowly, maybe to around 6% on average in 2011. Certainly not getting back down to that 4 or 3% where we're having a real problem with labor shortages. Non-residential construction, here we've got a mix of sun and cloud, some showers coming through. But overall, the temperatures won't be too bad. Obviously, a non-residential construction over the last couple years in the province, it's been led by commercial real estate, particularly in downtown Calgary. And if any of you, I don't know if a lot of you are from Calgary, or if you've seen downtown Calgary recently, but the skyline has been transformed again. And this is a pretty typical pattern for Calgary. At the tail end of every boom, we put 10 new office buildings online, and then they kind of sit empty for a little while, and then the bus comes. And you can almost mark the economic cycles in Calgary by the architectural styles of the buildings. And now we're going to have one again, a very distinct sort of postmodern architecture around 2006 to 2010, and now there's not going to be another building probably for another 5 or 10 years. That's pretty typical. Those vacancy rates of commercial office space is likely to hit 15%, if not higher. I'm not too worried about that because, again, this is a normal cycle for Calgary, and that will eventually get absorbed. It'll be a fantastic opportunity for companies looking to renegotiate leases or looking for office space. In Edmonton and places sort of in central and northern Alberta, the story has been more on the industrial construction. Places like around Red Deer and Nisku in the industrial heartland. I always tell people, again, you guys probably know the story, but if you ever have 15 minutes of free time, go Google Earth Nisku. It is massive, and I don't think Albertans have any idea how large of an industrial complex exists at Nisku. And I often thought if you could take Nisku, all those warehouses and fabricating shops, and stack them on top of each other, it would probably look something like a dustier version of downtown Calgary. Maybe not as many cappuccino bars, but in terms of its scope and its size, Nisku is a very large industrial complex. Both the industrial construction, the commercial construction is definitely going to cool in 2011. Where we are seeing some sun and some warm conditions still holding on is in the institutional spending, what Stats Canada calls institutional. Basically government spending on things like infrastructure. We're still seeing a lot of these billboards, Canada's Economic Action Plan of the federal government, and also provincial infrastructure. Any college campus or university campus around the province, there's a lot of construction still going on, hospitals, schools, that type of thing. That will be a nice offset to the cooling that we're seeing on the commercial and industrial. And finally, residential construction. Here is where we are seeing some cooling conditions, some cloud and some drizzle. I didn't put a lightning bolt in because I don't think it's actually going to be horrible, but I do think it is going to be cooling conditions on the residential side. Housing starts will come off from where they were in, actually throughout the recession in 2009, housing starts continued to sort of climb and housing prices climbed as well. They started to tip in early 2010, and I think we are going to see continued cooling. The big question everyone wants to know is, are we in a real estate bubble? Everyone seems to be fixated on bubbles. And I think we actually are in a bubble. But the good news is I don't think the bubble is very large. And therefore, any bursting of the bubble will likely be much less painful than, say, bubbles Arizona style, or Nevada, or Florida, or a lot of other places where these real estate bubbles had grown enormous. I think we probably are a little overpriced real estate-wise, but maybe a price correction in the order of 5 to 10%. Nothing like a 50% drop. Nothing that is going to send, I think, shock waves of panic down homeowners' backs. So to conclude then, I guess I would generally typify Alberta's economy next year. Sunny with a chance of showers. Overall, we are going to continue to grow. The recession of 2009 is behind us. We will likely be one of the faster growing Canadian provinces in 2011. But there might still feel, some residual showers hanging around, primarily because of those weak natural gas prices and the employment situation maybe not coming back as strongly as what we've been used to a couple of years ago. So with that, I will stop talking. I will just draw to your attention real quick. The daily economic comment is something that we prepare at ATB Financial. It's entirely free. If any of you are interested in it, it's a one-page, real quick and easy to read snapshot, usually highlighting some statistic on Alberta's economy. You can go to atb.com. You look for the little box that says Daily Economic Comment, and you can subscribe to that. It's entirely free. I'm also on Twitter. If Twitter is your thing, I want to tweet you nicely, as I always say. Oh, it's terrible. So if you go on Twitter, if you want, AB Economist is my handle, and I usually just offer a couple of tweets of things I'm observing in Alberta's economy or places I'm speaking at that day. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention.